We're in the Gospel of Mark today, chapter 12. Very familiar story, but it's not what you think it's about, as you can imagine by now, right? Mark chapter 12, verse number 38. We're going to read down all the way to verse number 44. It's a famous story of the widow and the two mites. And traditionally, this story has always been used as kind of an encouragement for us to give until it hurts, right? And that she is this model of faith for us to imitate, but she's actually a victim in the story. She's not someone to imitate. And we're going to learn that here in just a few moments and then discover a path forward for us. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which were worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." I want you to imagine the scene with me. You've walked for miles to get there. You're a pilgrim. You're coming in to celebrate a festival with your people. And you've saved for weeks and maybe months even. And just ahead, the temple is looming, and it is majestic. It's imposing. It promises mercy, atonement, connection with God. You're faithful, but you're poor. And all you have left are 2 small coins that are barely worth anything at all. And when you finally arrive at the place that should be a refuge, you're met with prices you cannot afford. Sacrifices that are sold like merchandise. Forgiveness that's traded like currency. And no one stops you from dropping your last coins into a system that will give you nothing in return. That's the scene that Jesus is walking into here. A temple that was built to reflect and mediate the mercy of God has become a marketplace. A faith that was meant to lift up the lowly and is turned into a business model. And there she is, a widow, 2 mites to her name, spiritually sincere but financially devastated. And keep in mind that Jesus, when he started preaching, said he came to preach good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to those who were held captive. And this lady gives everything she has, and she receives nothing in return. And while the religious leaders watch from their positions of privilege, Jesus is watching too, but he doesn't applaud. He protests. And he prepares to become the very offering that she could never afford. When access to God is sold, the poor are excluded. People are excluded. And Jesus comes and tears down a system that exploited the weak and the vulnerable in society, and he replaces that system with himself. Jesus becomes the sacrifice that could not be purchased. Now remember, if you go back and read in the earlier parts of Mark chapter 11, Jesus had already been in the temple. He had made his way into Jerusalem in view of his death. And then later on in Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 19, we read the story of Jesus cleansing the temple of its money changers. The celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover was at hand, and the Passover celebrated everybody's exodus from Egypt. It was combined with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and these feasts became symbols of hope and redemption for the people of God. They were central religious experiences in the life of those who identified with biblical Israel. And you might be wondering, well, why or how did they ever end up doing commerce in the temple? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 24 through 26 provided a principle that it was a working principle, so to speak. And it read this: "If the way is too long for you so that you're not able to carry the tithes when the Lord God blesses you, because the place is too far away, then you shall turn it into money and bind it up in a bundle and take it in your hand and go to the place that the Lord God chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire there. Oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. And so this principle in Deuteronomy made provisions for people to simply just bring their money to these pilgrim feasts instead of goods, just for the sake of convenience. It was easier to carry a wad of money than it was to lug around pigeons and lambs and everything else for sacrifices, right? Especially if they were traveling from a long distance. They were allowed to buy offerings and sacrifices upon their entry into Jerusalem. Further, some of the pilgrims that were coming from different places in the region where their currency would have to be exchanged so that it was appropriate for the temple, because there was a temple tax of a half a shekel. Exodus chapter 30 informs us of that. So the issue for most people at the time was not whether or not there should have been money changers, but whether it was valid to turn the outer court into a place of commerce instead of worship. Worship that was accessible to all people. And when commerce replaces worship, when someone's capacity to dump money into the offering plate becomes prioritized, it automatically excludes people that the system was supposed to protect and care for. And we find this similar prophetic critique throughout the Old Testament. Prophets like Micah, Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, they all spoke out against the economic and political and the religious systems that abused people and took advantage of them. Amos in particular is one of my favorites. That whole story begins off, there's a rhetorical strategy in play where Amos starts categorizing all of the sins of the neighbors, right? So Israel might feel smug about their own position and place in society, but then he flips the script on them and he says, you people are selling the poor for a pair of sandals. And by the time you get to the 5th chapter of the book of Amos, there are all these charges and indictments against them for all their empty religious expressions of piety that had no transformative impact upon their character. Amos denounces all of these empty expressions of religious devotion and practice because it didn't transform who they were as a people. And so by the time you get to Amos chapter 5, it is a funeral dirge for the house of Israel. He had been building up Israel and all of their smug excitement over the demise of their neighboring nations for doing things, acts of against common human decency were considered sinful, and they were doing the very same thing. And this is a people that were going to suffer the loss of everything they gained from extorting and taking advantage of the poor. The Lord would turn upon them. Everything they believed was their blessing would become their disaster. And so when Jesus flips the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves, and then he cries out, my Father's house is to be a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. He's quoting the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. It's interesting too, because when we read in Mark chapter 11 that Jesus flipped the seats of those who were selling doves, that Matthew and Mark are the only ones that mention the doves here. Doves were specific sacrifices that were accommodations for the poor. Leviticus chapter 5, verse 7, again in verse 11, and then in chapter 12, verse 8, made accommodations for the poor to bring a common pigeon as an offering of atonement if they could not afford a lamb. And if they could not afford a pigeon, they could bring a tenth of an ephah of flour, which was about 8 cups of flour. Those were sacrifices for the desperately poor. So if you were poor, you could bring a pigeon. If you were desperately poor, just bring some flour. Bring some flour. And so the scene of Jesus overthrowing the tables of the money changers and noting that they have turned the Father's house into a den of robbers has actually quite a bit to do with this story of the widow and her 2 coins. Jesus had just pointed out in Mark chapter 12, verse number 38 through 40, that these scribes, they love to walk around with their long robes. They love to be greeted and acknowledged in the marketplace and have importance amongst the people. And they wanted the best seats in the synagogue, and they wanted to be honored at the banquets, but they devoured widows' homes. And then for the sake of appearance, they made long prayers. Everything they did was just a performance. There was nothing genuine about anything that they did. There was nothing helpful. There was nothing healing unless you could pay the price. Unless you had the money to buy the sacrifices, it was worthless to you. And so Jesus is targeting a systemic exclusion of the most vulnerable people in society, the poor. The doves were for the poor, and a tenth of an ephah of flour was for those who were desperately poor. And if they were excluded because they could not afford to buy the required offering to have their sins atoned for, the widow giving her last 2 mites, which Jesus said was everything she had to live on, she left that temple in worse condition than when she arrived. That's how the temple had become a den of robbers instead of a house of prayer for all nations where everybody had access to the mercy and the grace of God. And just for clarification, these 2 mites, they were called lepta. This was the smallest coin in circulation at the time. And the widow, according to Jesus, she had put everything she had to live on in the offering plates. These 2 mites were the equivalent of 1/64th of a full day's wage. And we don't have any direct evidence in the New Testament just how much a dove would cost for the poor or how much 8 cups of flour would cost for the desperately poor. But the Jewish historian Josephus notes that the sacrificial animals that were sold in the temple, the prices were elevated. They were inflated, especially for poor pilgrims. And those prices, they were controlled by the temple authorities, possibly through contracts with merchants, the money changers. And then you get some additional insights from the Mishnah, which was an early Jewish oral law around 200 AD. In Keratot 1:7, it mentions that a pair of doves could cost as much as a day's wage. So this widow brings 1/64th of a day's wage. The cost of a dove was a full day's wage. She couldn't afford the sacrifice. She could not afford to hear those words of forgiveness pronounced over her life. Those words of mercy. Those words of grace. She couldn't afford the sacrifice. And so the temple that was meant to mediate the mercy of God robbed her of the mercy of God. And notice there wasn't a single teacher, not a single scribe, not a single priest stood by and told her, hey, keep your money, keep your money. And this makes Jesus' outcry even more of an explosive indictment. My Father's house is to be a house of prayer for all people, but you've made it a den of robbers. Isaiah chapter 56 was about welcoming strangers and foreigners and eunuchs and those on the margins of society. And Jeremiah 7, that part of the quote where it says, you've made my house a den of robbers, this was about religious people committing acts of atrocities against human decency and then hiding in the temple thinking that they were going to be okay because they showed up to church. They were part of the ecumenical boys club, so they're going to be safe, right? The very place that was meant to welcome the poor, the immigrant, the Gentile, a place that was to mediate the mercy and forgiveness of God had become a place where everybody's exclusion, unless you could pay the price, was sealed. And so what Jesus does is when he sees this widow giving her 2 mites, he's pointing to a real-time living example of something he just said the scribes do. They devour widows' homes. In fact, look, there's one right there. Look at her. She's given everything she has to live on, and she's going to leave in worse condition than when she came. Forgiveness, grace, mercy, it had to become a pay-to-play scenario, right? The poor had been stopped out by the market makers. They've been priced out of mercy and reconciliation. And so when Jesus observes that she gave more than the rich who gave their offerings out of their abundance, he's not celebrating her gift. He was observing how tragic it was. These were people who devoured widows' homes. And look, there she is right now. She's a victim. And who really benefited from that? The scribes did. The scribes benefited from her devotion. She leaves empty-handed. The temple receives her last 2 coins and nobody stops her. She's bled by a corrupt religious system and not a single priest, scribe, or teacher of the law stopped her to say, hey, put your money away. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not for sale. Instead, they just devoured everything she had to live on. And the fact that Jesus was critiquing the temple and the scribes and flipping tables and overturning seats of those who were selling sacrifices to the poor at inflated prices, And he was decrying the performative nature of the temple worship and the leadership who walked around in these long robes and wanted to be acknowledged in society, and they wanted the best seats and all the finest accommodations. This does not suggest that Jesus stood by approving of anything this poor woman had done. She was not a model of faith and generosity. She was a victim of the system. Instead of supporting her, this system just extracted from her. This temple had become the machine that fed on the poor. And so in the very next chapter, chapter 13, verse number 2, Jesus predicts its destruction. Not one stone will be left upon another. That's how Jesus felt about all of that. Now, there's some modern versions of devouring widows' homes that come to mind from some of the most influential church leaders in the world. I'm not going to mention any names, but we've all heard things like this. This widow gave everything to God, and we should do the same. Right? Or how about this? If you really loved God, you would sow into this ministry so we can keep reaching people with the gospel. Guilt-based appeals, right? What actually happens? Well, leaders build multi-million-dollar sanctuaries off the back of the poor. They're flying around in $20 million private jets, and they're living in mansions while the poor, the vulnerable, those on the margins of society are excluded. Access to God has now become about status and tithing and behavior and family giving units. This story isn't a model for us to imitate. It's a story that says, look how religion consumes and devours vulnerable people, and they call it holy. 2 mites was not enough to buy a dove. It wasn't enough for a grain offering. This widow gave everything to a religious system that took from her and gave her nothing back in return. And Jesus called it out. He condemned it. And then he becomes the sacrifice that nobody could afford. A lot of churches today may not be selling doves or charging for a few cups of flour, but they extract more than they give back and exclude more than they include. Churches sometimes talk about welcoming everybody, but in practice, we often create barriers that make it difficult for people and make people feel like outsiders. I remember when we were struggling as a family. I was a E4, E5 in the military, weren't making what they make now, and trying to support a family of 5. And we'd hear these appeals while the church is trying to build another $500,000 fellowship hall. Give your bills to God. We tried that. It doesn't work. God doesn't want our bills. He was like, I didn't make these. You made these bills. He doesn't want them. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. We even had a pastor one time that demanded everybody that was a member of the church write out what their gross income was and submit it to him so that he could tell if we were tithing enough. We've been a part of churches where women were expected to have long flowing hair that had never been cut. What do you do for a lady that has alopecia? Can you imagine how excluded she feels when she tries as hard as she can and she'll never fit in? Can't afford the modest clothes because the modest clothes cost a lot of money. Or youth camps, children's camps, right? That's another way, that's another barrier. We're going to send all these kids to camp, and by the way, it's $350. Well, you got a family of 6 kids. They can't afford $35. And so they got to go out there and beg and do car washes while the church sits on tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars in their general fund. It excludes people. The way you look. You guys have been amazing. I brag on you all the time how great you've been to me and my wife. We haven't received this kind of treatment, as you can imagine. And I get to brag on you all the time, and I say, you know what? You see how I look. You see how I am. I'm the same here as I am everywhere else. I'm not putting on a show for anybody. I'm not going to fake it till I make it. And these people have been great. They've said nothing about the fact that I'm covered in tattoos. Not a word. We feel welcome. And so I appreciate that, but that's not the case in a lot of places. It becomes about what you wear. And if you don't have your Sunday best on, well, for some people, a Sunday best might be a torn up pair of jeans or a pair of bibs. They've been out in the field all day working. I always got triggered by that too. Like we had to wear a suit and tie on Sunday morning, but somehow God relaxed at Sunday evening service. It wasn't as important on Sunday evening or Wednesday night. But by God, you'd better wear that suit and tie on Sunday mornings. This is the kind of stuff we talk about, welcoming everybody and being a place for everybody, and then participate in systems that erect barriers that make people feel like outsiders and that they cannot participate. What does Jesus do? And I'm going to close. I don't know that he'd be flipping tables and flipping seats, but I think Jesus would be flipping some budgets and priorities and attitudes about other human beings made in the image of God. People just trying to live their life, people who love God but feel excluded because of their socioeconomic status, their political affiliation, their personal identity. That's a system, folks, that is not going to last. They might feel excluded because of their history or their current struggles. Maybe they're a drug addict. Maybe they're an alcoholic. I've had people call me when I was pastoring and said, "Oh, I really want to come to your church. I just don't have any really nice clothes." I said, "Man, I don't care if you wear pajamas, just wear clothes, right? Just don't show up naked, please. Just put something on. Tie a bed sheet around you for all I care. You are welcome. I don't care what you look like." Jesus becomes the temple. Jesus himself becomes the temple that the political and religious establishment tried to destroy but failed. This is what Jesus does for those on the margins. Jesus becomes the lamb that the poor could never pay for. Jesus becomes the priest who freely mediates the grace and the mercy of God. No more doves, no more grain offerings, no more currency exchange, no more exploitation, no more exclusion of the vulnerable people, no more pricing people out of hope and redemption. At a time when people were coming to sacrifice lambs with atonement of their sins on their mind, Jesus becomes the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus becomes an offering that could not be bought. He gives himself up for those who have been excluded by the rest of society. And so how might we respond and participate in all of that? Well, we can refuse to build what Jesus came to tear down, first of all. We can build something better. We can become a house of prayer for all nations, a place that really does truly welcome everybody, a house of mercy, a house of grace, a house of welcome. We can build a home that includes a place for everybody at the table.